Guten Abend, Koschefe Freund, Herren und Damen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Es ist für unser Institut für jiddische Limudim Bichlau und für mir persönlich befragt, nicht nur ein größer Covid, nur öfter noch eine größere Hannoe zu können begrüßen, Professor Marc Caplan. Borchabo, seid begrüßt, Professor Caplan, vielleicht kurz vorstellen fahren wollen. So, our Institute for Jewish Studies welcomes with great pleasure Professor Marc Caplan, Borchabo, Professor Caplan, and I'll introduce him briefly. Professor Caplan ist geboren geworden in Louisiana, einem von den samen dormdicke Staaten von den Vereinigten Staaten. Graduiert hat cum laude, das heißt mit großer Auszeichnung, beim Universität Yale. In dem Jahr 2003 hat beim New Yorker Universität bekommen den Doktortitel mit der Dissertation wegen vergleichlicher Literatur. Professor Caplan is a native of Louisiana and a graduate of Yale University. In 2003, he earned his PhD in comparative literature from New York University. Seitdem hat bekommen akademische Bestimmungen beim Indiana und Pennsylvania Universität, bei Johns Hopkins und Harvard. Hat euch gehalten Gastlektionen in Deutschland, beim Konstanzer Universität und beim Center für jiddische Geschichte in New York. Since then, he has held appointments at Indiana University, University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, as well as visiting fellowships at the Universität Konstanz, Germany, and the Center for Jewish History in New York. In 2011 ist heraus von seiner Hand das Buch, und ich setze über, «Also fremd die Schiene». Auf Englisch klingt schöner, weil es ist da ein Gramm in dem Titel von dem Buch. Und der Titel geht weiter, «Loschen, Temporalität und erzählerische Formen in peripherische Modernismen». Was in dem Buch vergleicht Professor Caplan jiddische und afrikanische Literaturen. Und das Buch ist heraus bei der Stanford Universität Presse. So in 2011 he published How Strange to Change Language, Temporality and Narrative Form in Peripheral Modernisms. A comparison of Yiddish and African literatures. Professor Caplan, versteht sich, hat euch publiziert eine ganze Schule wissenschaftlicher Artikel von die alle jiddische Mechabrim. Deswegen hat umgeschrieben Artikel der Monik Blois, David Bergelsson, Alfred Deiblin, Moshe Kulbak, Josef Roth, der Nister, Reb Nachman, Sholem Aleichem, Yud Lamed Peretz und Achren Chovev, Yosef Opatoshu. Professor Caplan is also the author of numerous articles. Beim jetzigen Moment ist Professor Caplan ein Gastprofessor bei seiner Alma Mater. Auf Prost, Jiddisch so zu sagen, bei seiner alten Mama. Das heißt beim Yale Universität. Auch kurzem hat ihn schreiben ein Zweibuch wegen jiddischer Literatur, geschrieben bei der Weimarer Republik. Im Vergleich mit der damaligen deutschen Literatur, Theater und Film, lehavdil. Currently he is visiting senior lecturer at his alma mater, Yale, where he is completing a second book on Yiddish literature written in Weimar, Germany, considered in comparison with contemporaneous German literature. Professor Caplan's lecture is entitled Yiddish Exceptionalism, Lynching, Race and Racism in American Yiddish Fiction. Professor Caplans heintige Referat trug den Titel Jiddischer Exceptionalism, Lyncherei, Rasse und Rassism in der amerikanischen jiddischer Fiktion. Befragt die Talmides und Talmiden von Jiddisch sollen sich heint zuhören mit Cap. Professor Caplan mit dem rechten Fuß.
Well, thank you, Paul, for this lovely, beautiful, mellifluous, eloquent, bilingual introduction. This is, in fact, a first for me, to be introduced in two languages. I think that in Belgium, this is very, very appropriate, even if these aren't the right two languages to introduce someone in Belgium, but I'm appreciative nonetheless. Thank you so much, both for the introduction today and for your hospitality throughout my visit here in Antwerp. I want to thank Jan as well, without whom not only my visit, but the day-to-day life of the Institute for Jewish Studies would not be possible. And I appreciate everything that you do for this institute, and I'm sure that I speak for everyone who has had the great good fortune to pass through or to participate in the activities, all that you do. I'm really, really grateful. And again, just to quote Paul, Achron Hoviv, I want to thank Vivian Liska, who cannot be here tonight, but for her years of friendship, her support, and her mentorship of me personally. I certainly wouldn't be here tonight without her kind and generous invitation, but I would not have much of the great privilege and honor and pleasure of participating in academia to the extent that I do without her support. So I thank her in absentia, and I'm glad that this is being recorded so that possibly she can devote some of her very, very busy schedule to hearing my remarks and receiving my genuine debt of thanks. Most of all, thank all of you for coming. I'm a Yiddishist. I believe very strongly in the value of dialogue, even if that means sometimes everybody talking all at once. It's a very Yiddish thing to do. But even though I do have some prepared remarks today, this is merely the prelude. This is merely the overture. The main event is the opera, where I hope that we'll all have a chance to sing, and I welcome your comments, your corrections, your criticisms, and most importantly, your questions, so that this will not just be an academic dialogue, but maybe also Yiddish and schmooze as well. So a little bit of background about why I'm presenting on this subject tonight. First of all, I apologize for speaking in English. You will have an opportunity, those of you who are able to travel. I'm going to be giving another version of this same lecture on Saturday in Paris, in Yiddish. So if my English is unclear, imagine how unclear my Yiddish will be. But I'm really looking forward to that opportunity as well. That will be a double first, my first lecture in Paris and my first lecture on this theme in the Yiddish language. So again, if there's anything that I'm saying that's not clear, or that I go too fast, or that there's some concepts that maybe are overly familiar to me but might be brand new to you, please, we can talk about this during the question and answers afterwards, but I would really welcome your clarifications, and I would welcome to offer any clarifications that I can make for my remarks. Now, I was first invited to talk about this subject a few years ago, very happy years ago, a different historical era than the one that we live in now, and I always imagined then that I was writing about history. And the circumstance happened, I was sitting at home alone, the phone rang, and I answered it. And a colleague of mine, somebody I knew distantly, said, would you like to contribute to a conference on the American Yiddish writer Yosef Alpatoshu? And I said, listen, I'm sorry about this. I don't know. I don't really write about American Yiddish literature. And if I did write about American Yiddish literature, I don't think I'd write about Alpatashu. Not really my taste, not really my interest. I don't see that happening. I'm sorry. And he said, well, that's really a shame, because there's an all-expense-paid trip to Germany. Just a second, let me put Professor Caplan on the line. So anyway, when I began researching this article, I thought, this is history. This is something that happened a long time ago. This is something that Yiddish writers devoted themselves to, and that's interesting as part of the archive of the American history of racism, the Jewish encounter with American culture, American political culture, the history of American discrimination. But this is really something that's very far away. I did not imagine when I began preparing this article how relevant it is to today, to what's happening today in the United States, what's happening today in Europe, what's happening today all over the world. I am surprised, I'm a little bit frightened, but I'm also maybe a little bit hopeful about the pertinence of what I've uncovered, the documents that I've read through, the ideas that I've encountered. I hope that maybe these can provide us some constructive ideas in dealing with our own confrontation with these issues today. So with that as an introduction, let me start by saying, well, let's talk about a poem. Most of the American Yiddish literature that we read today, most of the writers that we think of when we think about American Yiddish literature are poets. And some poets are really, really remarkable in this context. Experimental, courageous, creative, dynamic. I want to talk about one of the most interesting poems that I know. It's written in 1926 by the American Yiddish writer Aleph Leolis. It's called In the Subway. And it takes a rather unexpected turn midway in the third section of this long lyric poem, when the speaker imagines, perhaps himself, as an African-American man in a subway car pressing against a white female passenger. Now, we can talk about this aesthetically as an example of high modernism in Yiddish literature. And if we do so, we find that the uneasy juxtaposition of a black man, a white woman, apparent strangers, represents the danger and desire of accidental, disorienting encounters in the modern city, as well as the internal logic of a poetic strategy that produces meaning out of unexpected and incongruous combinations of words and sounds. The poem's rapid, almost rapping rhymes are as significant as the image of urban dystopia it depicts. And the effect of the whole reiterates the original paradox of an American poet writing in Yiddish and a Yiddish poet writing not about the Eastern European shtetl, as we might expect, but about the American metropolis. These avant-garde strategies venture into the phantasmagoric, the imaginary, the horrifying, the unexpected, the impossible. When the author writes, "A weiß Mädel und a Neger, treuer in dem rieren, dicken, greuen Mäuer, treuer von einem Jäger, was weiß, als kann gegarzen fang, nicht kriegen, nicht enten auf die Relsen redeln Räder, wirbeln, schwindeln, drehen, in schwarzen, kreiseldicken, im blicklichen Kopf, Lynching, Feier, Flacker, Flacker, Schleifen, Flieh, Steifer, der Neger drückt sich starker zu dem Mädel." A white girl and a Negro mourning in the turning gray wall, mourning of the hunter who knows that he cannot capture his prey, not underneath where the wheels turn and churn. They steam, they make dizzy, they turn over in a black, curly, unlucky head. The fires of lynching, they flicker, the the knot, the noose of the hanging rope stiffer, and the Negro turns stronger to the girl. In this image, the turning subway wheels generate a vertigo through which the man's desire for the woman transforms him from the pursuer to the pursued, and the heat generated by a wall of people in claustrophobic proximity becomes the flames consuming the man's body as punishment for a sexual crime still only imagined. Although the entire purpose of this portrayal of sexualized racial taboo is to shock the reader, it is nonetheless unsurprising that Laelis makes reference to lynching. Lynching is a recurring theme in American Yiddish poetry. Perhaps the most complicated, provocative, problematic depiction of this issue in Yiddish literature, however, can be found in a long story by Yosef Opatoshu called Lyncherei, literally lynching, first published in book form in Warsaw in 1923. Indeed, Lyncherei is the only extended narrative in the collection in which it first appears, but it introduces a series of much shorter vignettes, presumably appearing originally in Der Tag, a New York Yiddish daily to which Opatoshu was a lifelong contributor, which dramatize other aspects of what we would now term American multiculturalism. Race and racism, anti-Semitism, intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews, and the plight of non-Jewish immigrants from Russia, Poland, Italy, and China, among other themes. It is safe to contend that no other Yiddish writer, and maybe no other American writer, offers a more graphic examination of racist violence toward African Americans than Opatoshu does in the 35 or so pages of this story. Its central action is the pursuit and lynching of a young African American man, Bookert. One wonders if this might be a mistaken rendering of the name Booker, as in Booker T. Washington. In short episodes, the story progresses from the perspective of Bookert's grandfather, Jim, and once again, the association of his name with the African-American protagonist of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn is irresistible. The story also includes Bookert's mother and siblings, the sheriff of Burke, Georgia, the white townspeople who anticipate the lynching, the lynch mob leader McClure, whose daughter apparently has been violated by Bookert, though this in turn is retaliation for McClure having himself violated Bookert's sister, and eventually Bookert's own flight, capture, and tortuous execution by the lynch mob. The panoramic perspective of the story provides a focused and urgent example of Opatoshu's lifelong commitment to an aesthetic of literary realism, a practice that in its broadest dimensions serves to illustrate, valorize, and critique the processes by which a society rationalizes and modernizes itself. Like the great novelists of the 19th century European literature, Opatoshu uses literature to hold a mirror up to a society as a synthetic and synchronic whole. The problem, however, for Yiddish literature in America, a problem that makes this belated investment in realism provocative and useful for understanding the realist project generally, is determining to what extent a writer, such as Opatoshu, can effectively represent his adopted nation in Yiddish, when one of the few universal traits of American public life, in his day as much as at present, was the monolingual predominance of the English language. As the ensuing discussion will argue, Opatoshu's artistic shortcomings in this instance enable the story he narrates to provide an invaluable, if complicated, insight into the sociology of racism. The use of realist narrative strategies in a Yiddish story about lynching captures the contradictions of American racism, because the story's very existence is, in a sense, contradictory. In a 1954 essay, Opatoshu offers his assessment of Yiddish culture in America over the previous 6 decades, starting with the Sweatshop Poets and the first issue of the journal Die Zukunft, and concluding with perhaps surprising optimism about the continued vitality of Yiddish in America after the Holocaust. 2 comments from the essay are especially relevant for assessing Opatoshu's own writing, which he nowhere mentions in his remarks, and its approach to American themes. Of America itself, Opatoshu writes, quote, "There is a rhythm in America that is alien to Europe. Not the external rhythm that is only skin deep, but the inner rhythm that comes from getting to be at home in the country with the average American, of whom 1 of 2 traces his ancestry back to 4 or 5 different peoples. On the location of Yiddish in the United States, he writes, by contrast, quote, Yiddish literature in the United States, though far from its source of origin, assumed an artistic form in many respects superior to the work of the first masters, reminding one that the great Polish works of Mickiewicz and Słowacki were written not in Poland, but in France and in Switzerland." These observations crystallize the general argument of the essay that one of the challenges to writing in Yiddish in the United States is the multicultural mix of dynamism and danger that characterizes American society and distinguishes it from the ostensibly homogeneous culture of Eastern European Jewry with which Yiddish writers continue to identify their ethnic origins. Even when writing on American subjects, Yiddish literature thus remains the work of an exiled and peripheral culture. For the American Yiddish writer, consequently, the natural habitat for Yiddish culture and the primary measurement of cultural authenticity is to be found for the American Yiddishist, like the Polish nationalist in exile, not where he or she is, but where he or she is from. Given both the enormity of Opatoshu's output, as well as the intellectual curiosity that motivates the entirety of his career, it should nonetheless come as no surprise that writing about America in Yiddish motivates some of the author's most interesting and innovative fiction. To an equal degree, however, it should come as no surprise that this fiction in many respects actually confirms the focus he prescribes for Yiddish literature on its own ethnic integrity, as well as its orientation not to the American present, but to the traditions of a Jewish past. And I make these remarks simply for those who are familiar with Opatoshu. His reputation stands primarily as the great author of historical fiction in modern Yiddish literature. He was known as a writer of historical novels, not observations about contemporary American society. That's why I wanted to focus on some of his lesser-known works in these remarks. Although Opatoshu deserves credit in Lynching for his capacities of moral imagination, emotional empathy, and political indignation when confronting the most egregious human rights problem in the United States at that time, the story not only reveals the inevitable limits that particularly a talented writer encounters when trying to depict a fundamentally foreign culture, a less talented or ambitious writer would never approach these limits in the first place, but also suggests analogous limits for representing ethnic difference within the discourse of Yiddish fiction generally. At the outset of the story, Opatoshu provides a description of an African-American character, the grandfather Jim, that reads as a compendium of dehumanizing stereotypes. Quote, "At the threshold in the shadows sat an old Negro. His distended arms hung around his feet, and the heavy palms with outstretched fingers seemed to touch the earth. He dozed with half-shut eyes, his short, flat nose with flared nostrils, the curls on his head, which extended to his eyebrows, the bare arms with shoulders covered in gray fleece. All of this resembled an aged orangutan." I assure you it sounds no better in Yiddish than it does in English. This unfortunate description indicates that Opatoshu resorts to the same cliches when describing an unfamiliar ethnicity that other writers of his day, better acquainted with black people and with ethnic difference, recycled habitually. If you think he's bad, take a look at Joseph Conrad. But when you take a look at Joseph Conrad, remember, Conrad was providing the most important critique of imperialism and colonialism in its heyday that we have in the English language. Now, a more interesting literary and linguistic problem presents itself when describing black characters not as an ethnic type, but as people interacting with other people. For example, when Jem greets the sheriff and his deputies at his door, he takes note of the occasion by calling them "Ongelek the guest," welcome guests, sounding more like Shalom Aleicham's Tevye the dairyman than an African-American from the Jim Crow South. By conspicuous contrast, when Bookert's mother hears the unwelcome news that he is wanted for the rape of McClure's daughter Carrie, she crosses herself silently and fervently, a gesture more characteristic of Polish Catholics than American Protestants. These two details point to a larger problem in Opatoshu's approach to portraying black people, one that ultimately resonates with other Yiddish depictions at the time. Are African Americans as a powerless and degraded people to be likened to Jews or to Slavic peasants? Does the perspective of the description assume that they are identical to Jews or inversely other? This is a tension, I would argue, that continues to characterize Jewish portrayals of African Americans throughout American literature of the 20th century. This problem, though, Opatoshu's problem, is as much linguistic as it is psychological or political. Though American discourse, and particularly African American discourse, is as rooted in the Bible as Yiddish discourse is, it is nevertheless difficult, beyond Opatoshu's rhetorical assumptions, to find equivalences between English idioms and Yiddish ones. Consider, in this regard, the remark of a farmer who has come with the sheriff to serve papers on Bookert at the beginning of the story. Quote, "Even when you'll hear the last blast of the shofar, a Negro will still say amen after the priest's sermon." Now, true, American Protestantism shares with Jewish eschatology a concept of Gabriel's trumpet, ushering in either apocalypse or redemption. But nonetheless, das letzte Blasen von Schäfer neither captures the southern idiom, nor does it render the image it signifies closer to a Jewish means of expression. Similarly, when the same man complains about people saying amen after the priest's sermon, dem Galach's drosha is neither a Protestant minister's sermon nor a Catholic priest's homily. By the same token, when Jim exclaims, "Wie ich bin a Christ," as sure as I'm a Christian, it fails to match either the rhetorical power or the literal meaning of "Az ich bin a Yid," sure as I'm a Jew. Because unlike the inextricable equation of Yiddish with Jewishness, an equivalence that Opatoshu resists in this story, Christianity in America can be affirmed neither univocally nor monolingually. The problems Opatoshu encounters when imagining a black character go beyond the linguistic challenges of rendering an Anglophone or English language consciousness in Yiddish. They return the reader's attention to more essential, or, as I would say in an academic context, essentializing questions of how literature relates for Opatoshu to the history and traditions of a specific language and culture. When Jem inevitably associates Bookert's fate in the 20th century with his own childhood memories of slavery, the author renders his thoughts by writing, quote, "The whip flew over the skin with a whistle, eating its way into the blood, and a natal fear that maybe his ancestors experienced in the African jungles when they crawled on all fours to hide themselves so that a wild animal would not tear them to shreds. That same fear was awoken in him." Now, let's be fair to Opatoshu for a second. The image of African ancestors crawling on all fours, that's undeniably racist. But the larger comparison equates the white slave driver with wild animals. a more pointedly dehumanizing image that serves to reverse the logic of white supremacy by rendering the white racist much lower on the evolutionary scale than the black people whom he brutalizes physically and terrorizes psychologically. Because Opatoshu has inherited a discourse about black people from white racism, it can nonetheless only inhabit the limits set by that discourse in its imaginative poverty. Had Opatoshu been describing Jewish suffering, by contrast, he could have, and I assure you he would have, drawn on a ready-made stock of images derived from biblical narrative, folk legend, rabbinical rhetoric, and the whole history of the Jewish diaspora. Describing the suffering of American black people, however, he reverts to an image of a primordial ahistorical past. The rhetorical problem of finding the language to describe black suffering bespeaks and begets a narrative problem of how to align the narrator's obvious sympathies for black characters confronting the injustice of American racism with the obligation of translating these experiences into a recognizable Yiddish idiom. This challenge is a consequence of the author's need to confront two languages simultaneously within the monolingual rules of literary realism. The disconnection of English with Yiddish results in what might be described as a polytonal narrative situation, like a musical composition played in two keys at the same time. Although literary modernism, like the Layalist poem that I quoted at the beginning of my remarks, particularly, but not exclusively in Yiddish, cultivates what I'm calling these linguistic dissonances. Polytonality in realist fiction is as disruptive as it is in a tonal composition, because it underscores the irreparable disconnection between the social elements that the realist narrative would be expected to dramatize and thus reconcile. This artistic flaw nonetheless contributes to the story's moral value. By capturing the contradictions of American racial discourse, Opatoshu makes of American racism an object that exposes the inability to reconcile the social dissonances of the culture for a rational and national modernity. Opatoshu's failure as a realist, moreover, underscores his temporal, political, and thematic affinities with contemporaneous Yiddish modernism. Even unwittingly or unwillingly, it is perhaps the fate of the peripheral writer to approach the avant-garde, if only by virtue of his status between languages and between cultures. Indeed, in order for a realist narrative to provide a harmonizing perspective on the various social elements through which it constitutes itself, it must focus on a central character, space, or social institution that brings coherence to the social dimension of the story it relates. Hence, the reliance of realist novels on the country boy come to the big city, or the unhappy marriage of two people from different classes or generations, or the life of the stock market, or the railroad, or the convergences of different classes and worldviews at a market, at a parade, or at a harbor. I've probably just referenced 12 or 13 novels that you yourself have read in your own reading history. For Opatoshu, the problem of reconciling the American experience with a Yiddish perspective could perhaps understandably be negotiated by Jewish characters, particularly Yiddish-speaking immigrants. This strategy imparts on Lynching a curious dramatic structure, but one that ultimately points to the ethical essence of the story and its relevance for a Yiddish readership. At the very middle of the narration, Opatoshu interrupts the main action of the story to present an exchange between what are apparently the only Jewish residents of the town. In schematic terms, therefore, these Jews stand midway between the story's focus on Bookert's family and the pursuit of Bookert by the lynch mob. Jews stand in the story midway between blacks and whites, yet in structural as well as linguistic terms, they are detached from both. Now, there are three Jewish characters in the story. the hardware store owner Levi, his son, and a shoemaker named Harry. Levi actively opposes Bookert's lynching and speaks to his son in Yiddish. His son replies to him in English and actively seeks to participate, if not necessarily in the torture of Bookert, at least in the celebrations that accompany the spectacle. The shoemaker, who conspicuously uses the English expression all right, an emblem in American Yiddish of assimilation and the abandonment of Jewish communal spirit, more ambiguously appears at the carnival, but doesn't take a visible role in the crime itself. As this schematic relationship suggests, the role of Yiddish serves as a moral index for the positioning of these characters, and the implications of this are manifest already in the conflict between Levi and his son, as Opatoshu writes. "You won't go. I will go. And if I say no, you won't. A Jew shouldn't get involved. And if it were my sister? Why do you have to think about what might happen? It won't happen. It won't happen. But if they'll allow a drunk like McClure to act as judge, I can assure you that today they'll lynch a Negro, tomorrow a Jew." Levi's warning to his son that where blacks are lynched, Jews are similarly endangered alludes explicitly to the 1915 lynching of Leo Frank, which took place like lyncherai in rural Georgia, and which was the most explicit and violent anti-Semitic episode in American history. Whether or not lyncherai first appeared, as some commentators have stated, in the year of Frank's murder, this atrocity would certainly have been on the reader's mind whenever and wherever the story appeared. Levi therefore has the advantage over his son of actual historical precedent in arguing that Jewish identification with American society lies not in cultural affinity with white people, but the political liberty guaranteed by rational social institutions to all citizens, Jews as much as the African Americans, whom otherwise depicts in the language of racial inferiority that was pervasive in his day. Indeed, on a political level, such rhetoric actually reinforces the political case Opatoshu makes for the equal protections of the Constitution in a historical moment when they were not only contested, but nearly eclipsed. Opatoshu is arguing even African Americans, as much as Jews or any other citizens, deserves constitutional rights. As the sheriff in Lyncherai explains to Bookert, before unwittingly handing him over to the lynch mob, quote, "The law doesn't know from white or black. Under the law, all are equal." The reader, then as now, recognizes the lie of these statements. In 1923, lynching was not even a federal crime in the United States, and the sheriff's weakness parallels Levi's powerlessness over his own son. What transpires in the sheriff's failure to implement legal order is the ritual that Opatoshu describes at the end of the story, which demonstrates how tenuous the power of rationality and justice are, either in the Georgia of his fiction or the Georgia of contemporaneous fact. And who knows what we can say about the Georgia of the present day as well. Nonetheless, as the historian Hasia Diner notes, the faith in the rule of law that the sheriff both represents and betrays is a characteristic feature of Yiddish advocacy in Opatoshu's day. As she quotes from the Yiddish journalist Philip Krantz, writing in 1918, quote, "Our black fellow citizens are still being held down in spite of all the provisions of the United States Constitution, in spite of paper statements about equal recognition of citizens, even if he does not have the luck to be covered with white skin." Diner cites this as evidence of a general attitude in the Yiddish press, and in this respect, one should not be surprised to encounter little difference between the liberalism of Opatoshu's Tog and the democratic socialism of the Forwards, where Philip Krantz was writing. Like Opatoshu, Krantz cites the U.S. Constitution in his indictment of American racism, so that he, like Opatoshu, identifies with the ideals of American political culture while condemning the reality of American racism. Opatoshu's fiction echoes Kranz's position, in that he identifies race as a central political problem in American society, while resisting a complacent identification with the dominant white and English-speaking culture. This culture, as Opatoshu recognizes, in fact, can only constitute itself as white against a blackness that it unites in order to oppress. And here I'm quoting Opatoshu. Soon in the afternoon, the farmers began to gather together around the Indian mound. People who were almost unable to speak to one another, who had avoided one another their entire life, despised one another, in the instance discarded their prejudices, ceased to divide themselves as Americans, Germans, Italians, and Slavs, forgot their individuality as if it had never existed and united. This was the white race that had come together to settle scores with the black. Opatoshu gathers all of Europe together in this spectacle, but not Jews. He maintains the moral and ethnic difference of Jewishness, even as this exceptionalism impedes his work's narrative logic. If so little would be at stake for Jews in it, why was it written in Yiddish for an exclusively Jewish readership? The aim of the Yiddish press in general, including the fiction of writers such as Opatoshu, can be characterized as a critical Americanization. The act of identifying with America in Yiddish preserves a distance from the object of identification. Yiddish serves in this context to maintain the distinctness of Jewish ethnicity, particularly among Jews who had largely abandoned religious observance, even as the Yiddish press as an institution contributes to the integration of its readers, including, vicariously, the audience subscribing to the American press or reading its writers in Europe. For this reason, the argument that, for example, the Constitution in its original version actually institutionalized the racial inequality against which American blacks struggled is ultimately beyond the point for Opatoshu. Opatoshu instead expresses a simultaneous identification with and skepticism toward the claims of what would now be referred to as American exceptionalism, what makes America supposedly a distinct democracy against all the other nations of the world. This ambivalence is also the function of the Yiddish language in preserving a sense of Jewish difference, counterpoised to the model of American assimilation. It is precisely this sense of linguistic and cultural difference that Opatoshu dramatizes and defends by depicting the moral contrast between Levi and his son in terms of the language they each speak. Such a distinction might be termed, for want of a phrase, Yiddish exceptionalism. And this concept that Jews remain distinct from other American ethnicities, above all with respect to race relations, continues to play a foundational role in Jewish liberalism, and I mean liberalism in the American sense, not in the economic or European sense, in the foundational role in Jewish liberalism long after the heyday of radical Yiddishists such as Opatoshu. Opatoshu's reliance on institutionality as the source of his Americanism, in fact, underscores the claims he makes explicit in his 1954 essay. By suggesting an identification with America via the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the law, as opposed to embracing an American ethnic or even post-ethnic identity. Americanism in this sense both parallels an original conception of Judaism as a civilization rooted in acceptance of divine law, and also contrasts with a modern, desacralized concept of Jewishness, understood precisely as an ethnicity, an alternate national loyalty that nevertheless would not contradict American citizenship. Racism, in these terms, necessarily stands as the polar opposite of just such an identification, both in its manifestations against black people and as anti-Semitism against Jews. Opatoshu's Americanism, therefore, is as dependent in an ideological sense on the honorable, if ineffectual, intentions of the sheriff, as his narrative depends in a dramatic sense on Booker's guilt in the rape of McClure's daughter. The drama, and the ideology of the story work at cross purposes. And this contradiction lays bare the limits of literary realism as a representational strategy, as well as exposing the contradictions of American society. What I mean is the fictional logic of lynching seems to demand an actual act of interracial sexuality, whether consensual or not, whereas the political purpose of lynching as a motif in fiction would forbid just this development. The dramatic imperatives of lynching as a literary motif underscored the extent to which Opatoshu's representation of the issue was dependent on racist stereotypes. And yet his work can be seen not just as recycling these stereotypes, but, because they are received rather than embraced, archiving them. It is just this dramatic consideration that perhaps explains why lynching is a relatively marginal theme in the African American literature of Opatoshu's contemporaries. Removing the racist presumption of guilt from lynching fiction deprives the story of a dramatic counterweight to the violence at its conclusion, and would accordingly reduce the fiction from tragic ritual, which is how Opatoshu understands it, to sadistic spectacle. Whereas its inclusion, that is, the inclusion of sexual violence, legitimates the racist fantasy, the racist projection that fueled actual lynchings, and would obligate the author to broach the taboo subjects of interracial sex, desire, and violence. Such anxieties, which I'm arguing African American writers of Opatoshu's day felt, fail to register as significantly in Yiddish literature of the era. And so the use of the motif provides the occasion for Yiddish writers, such as Leilis the poet or Opatoshu the novelist, to empathize with black suffering, while transgressing both the American racial divide and the thematic decorum of previous Yiddish writing devoted exclusively to Jewish characters and Jewish problems. Unlike his modernist contemporaries in the Harlem Renaissance, Opatoshu is willing to attempt a depiction of a lynching scenario, and the result maintains a historical, sociological value far beyond the polemical purpose it served for its original readership. In this respect, the conclusion of Lyncherei not only fulfills the ritualistic, tragic components of the lynching fiction, but also transforms Opatoshu's realist polemic literally into a passion play, a sacrificial ritual that in its mythical elements, which conflate eros, sex, with violence and death, constitutes an anti-modern, reactionary resistance to the modernizing regime that the sheriff ineffectually attempts to institute, and which Opatoshu, as the narrator of the story, champions. The transition from literary realism to metaphysical parable occurs with a description of a cemetery. Quote, "A cemetery stretched down the hill, surrounded by a white stone fence, the graves running in even lines, and when approaching nearer, the broad stones resembled whitewashed little houses, and the white crosses over them told of mercy and a crucified God that calls himself to the weak." Taking his cue from this description, Opatoshu invests Bookert's death with the mythic paradoxes of Christian salvation. He becomes both crucified deity and redeemed believer. Seizing on this status, Bookert makes a last request to the mob, an occurrence that in an actual lynching would have been as unlikely as it is dramatically compelling in Opatoshu's fiction. He asks to read from the Bible, and his selection is aptly eschatological. Quote, "After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was, as it were, of a trumpet talking with me, which said, 'Come up hither, and I will show thee things which must be hereafter.'" Revelations 4:1. Thank you, Wikipedia, for letting me look that up. Bookert's voice rang louder and clearer. His eyes turned heavenwards like a saint, just as the first Christians must have appeared when they stood before the pyres. Now, Opatoshu's use of Christian rhetoric here is part of a general trend in Yiddish literature of the era, which both domesticates a foreign reference system for Yiddish readers, implicitly claiming Jesus as a Jewish cultural hero and role model for their own radicalism, and by identifying Jesus not with downtrodden Jews, but with their fellow sufferers, African American Christians. He therefore preserves a sense of religious and cultural difference, separating Jews from other Americans. Unlike other Yiddish writers using Christian imagery in the era, Opatoshu displaces the identification of Jesus with Jewishness onto African Americans and black spiritual discourse, thereby preserving the decorum of realist fiction while transcending its rationalizing limitations. Further completing the transition from realism to ritual, Bookert concludes his declamation by tearing pages out of the Bible and spreading them over the crowd that is gathered beneath them. The temporary spell of Bookert's words, which prompts one member of the lynch mob to disentangle himself from their actions and denounce the others as false Christians, comes to an end when an automobile carrying wood for the lynching pyre arrives. The modern conveyance is thus decoupled from its modernizing function, and instead prompts the lynch mob to denounce the man who had just left their company as a Yankee, reiterating the reactionary regionalist resistance to the nation-state. At the same time as this gesture preserves the rationalizing critique of literary realism, the author superimposes onto this rhetoric the cosmological conflict of paganism against Christianity and, implicitly or ironically, Jewishness, and barbarism against modernity. Opatoshu writes, "The crowd went wild, embracing each other, shouting as if it had in the instant freed itself from something foreign, which was hanging like a chain around its feet, and it appeared that an idolatry that had slumbered for 2,000 years reawakened in the people, took its revenge upon the tortured bodies, the flogged skins, as if to tear out at the roots generations of restraint. They took the crucified God, who with his magic word, mercy, had smashed all their idols, done battle with immorality and sin, and refastened him to his post and set it alight." In Opatoshu's parable, racism transforms the white Christian into his imagined opposite, the savage pagan. What this violent contrast between politics and metaphysics, realism and ritual achieves in total is a significant departure from what one might expect from a Yiddish depiction of lynching, and possibly quite different from what the author may have intended for this story. In its uneasy conjunction of irreconcilable elements, it frustrates the commonly understood purpose of realism, while retaining mostly faithful to its aesthetic means. As much as the violence it depicts is dedicated to the refutation of American modernity and the primacy of the nation state, Yiddish literature in America, from the exact opposite end of the political and moral spectrum, also offers a rejoinder to the assumptions of an American national culture and the place of Jews in it. The achievement of this story, as confused as it is in its particulars, challenges a complacent notion of what Yiddish can express about the Jewish immigrant encounter with America. And here's where I'm going to end. There was once no shortage of readers unwilling to acknowledge that a story like Lynching could be written in Yiddish. As a representative example of this critique, Isaac Bashevis Singer, an author otherwise quite resistant from his own perspective to playing the role of spokesperson for anybody, writes in a rather controversial essay from 1943, and I quote, "The idea that Yiddish literature can be cosmopolitan and equal among equals was, from the beginning, built upon a misconception. The Jews who wanted to be 100% cosmopolitan switched to other cultures and grew accustomed to foreign languages. Those drawn to Yiddish were bound by 1,000 threads to the whole spiritual baggage of the diaspora. The diaspora, the Jewish communities and their leaders, rabbis, ritual slaughterers, trustees and scholars, the pious shopkeeper and the artisan, the fervent housewife and the yeshiva boy and the child bride. This is and shall remain the subject of Yiddish literature. Now, we can digress and say Isaac Bashevis Singer came to write about America just fine, but never let it be said that he was troubled by too much consistency in his arguments. Now, in a sense, Opatoshu seems to arrive at a similar conclusion when he turns from the socially motivated descriptions of contemporary life to another version of literary realism, the historical novel. Although Lynching does not signify the achievement of imaginative affinity, one might hope for a Jewish leftist writing about African Americans. The effort to write on this theme is nonetheless not in vain. If the shortcomings of the story confirm Bashevis's conclusion, the compelling aspects of the narrative reiterate these conclusions in terms far less smug than the future Nobel laureate would formulate. Themes like the lynching of American blacks could neither be rationalized nor redeemed by the Yiddish language or by literary realism. It is to the credit of Yiddish and its speakers that no native term for lynching exists. It is to Opatoshu's credit as a writer that this does not stop him from addressing the subject and testing the limits of his own imagination. The desire to test those limits is the task of literature, of whatever language or aesthetic, and in that sense, an experiment need not be successful to be significant. Thank you.